In the house where reality wore thin around the edges, where secrets clung to old walls like dust motes in amber sunbeams, young Morty first heard the universe humming, not through his ears, but through the spaces between his heartbeats. The Smith family home on Rainier Avenue looked ordinary enough from the sidewalk, with its beige siding and Jerry's perpetually crooked mailbox. But if you knew how to listen, really listen, you could hear the soft wheeze of dimensional fabric, stretching at the seams, the gentle sigh of infinite possibilities bleeding through the walls, like watercolor bleeding through paper. Morty discovered this on a Tuesday night in October, when sleep teased at the edges of his consciousness but never quite arrived. Above his dresser, a hairline crack in the wall had always been there, no wider than a pencil line but somehow deeper than the wall itself. Behind his bedroom mirror, something had learned to breathe. He noticed it first as a whisper of cool air against his cheek when he leaned close, then as a rhythm that matched no heartbeat he knew. 4 counts in, 6 counts out, patient as falling leaves. The breathing carried a tune without words, a lullaby filtered through dimensions and softened. By distance, it reminded him of his grandmother's humming from before she got sick, when she used to fold laundry with the practiced grace of someone who understood that small rituals could hold enormous love. But this humming came from somewhere else entirely, somewhere that existed in the spaces between here and there, between is and might be. He didn't startle when the mirror grew warm beneath his fingertips. He did what the quiet asked you to do, matched his breath to it, slow and steady. Between heartbeats, he could almost see another boy shaped like him, but older at the eyes, watching with a sympathy that felt like news from the future. The breath carried his name almost, just the beginning of it, the soft M that opens and closes like a wave. Morty began bringing offerings the way children bring treasures to parks, without plan, just the instinct to share. A paperclip straightened and bent into a crooked star, a button from his winter coat that still smelled faintly of his mother's citrus soap, a corner of toast he didn't finish, cinnamon still thinking about him. He slid each small thing between, mirror and frame, and whispered, "For you," like a promise to keep paying attention. His days learned to listen too. He noticed the second before a knock when the air in the hallway tucked itself in, learned to open doors just as visitors reached for them, as if welcoming were becoming a reflex. He waited a heartbeat before answering questions, discovered that people said truer things when given one extra space to be brave. Nothing dramatic, just a softness that lingered, a quality of attention that made plants on windowsills tremble, as if remembering rain. Rick noticed, but in his typical fashion, he noticed by not mentioning it directly. Instead, he started leaving small tests around the house, a device that hummed at frequencies only interdimensional travelers should hear, a pen that wrote in ink visible only to those touched by cosmic radiation. Morty passed these tests without trying, his growing sensitivity to the spaces between realities making him increasingly aware of the subtle wrongness that surrounded his grandfather like familiar cologne. The crack above his dresser continued to sing, and Morty continued to listen, but now he understood that the listening was changing him in ways that couldn't be undone. Each night of cosmic lullabies rewired something fundamental, teaching him to perceive the universe not as a fixed thing, but as a conversation, a constant negotiation between what was and what could be. He was becoming fluent in the language of possibility, and with that fluency came a terrible and wonderful responsibility. By November, he could feel the dimensional membrane growing thinner throughout the entire house, as if his listening had created a kind of cosmic erosion. And sometimes in the deepest part of the night, when even his own breathing seemed too loud, Morty could swear he heard other voices joining the chorus, other versions of himself, learning to listen across the vast expanse of what might be, all of them breathing together in the gentle rhythm of infinite understanding. The morning after the voices joined his midnight chorus, Morty woke with the strange certainty that breakfast had become a ceremony. Not because anyone told him so, but because his hands knew things they hadn't known the day before. The exact angle to hold a knife when cutting crusts, the precise pressure needed to spread peanut butter without tearing bread, the way love could be folded into triangles and wrapped in care like a secret meant to be discovered slowly. The cosmic breathing from behind his mirror had followed him downstairs, settling into the kitchen's quiet corners like morning mist. Rick shambled. Gone at 7:30 sharp, lab coat wrinkled and smelling of ozone and something that might have been regret. He never asked for breakfast, never mentioned being hungry. But Morty had learned to read the spaces around his grandfather's silences, the way Rick's shoulders carried themselves differently when he was running on black coffee and stubbornness, the particular quality of his sighs when he opened the refrigerator and found only condiments and Jerry's expired optimism. So Morty made sandwiches. Not just any sandwiches, but careful constructions of attention. White bread because Rick claimed wheat was for people who had given up on joy. Peanut butter spread to every corner because uneven coverage was chaos in edible form. Grape jelly, because it reminded Rick of something he'd never quite articulated, but sometimes hummed when he thought no one was listening. The crusts came off in perfect curves, no jagged edges, no waste, just the soft parts that made eating easier for someone whose jaw still clenched from dreams he couldn't quite forget. Morty began decorating the napkins without planning to, the way children draw on fogged windows or trace patterns in spilled salt. Crayon stars in the corners, tiny rockets that looked more like wishes than machines, chemical formulas that spelled out "good morning" in the periodic table's secret language. They were never perfect. Some leaned into corners, others drifted toward edges. He liked them that way, constellations that weren't sure of themselves yet but still brave enough to shine. Rick ate without praise, but Morty noticed how he held each sandwich like it might dissolve if handled roughly. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully, his usual manic energy settling into something that resembled peace. And when he finished, he folded the napkin, always the napkin, never thrown away, always folded with the careful precision of someone preserving evidence of tenderness. The napkins disappeared from the kitchen counter and reappeared later, glimpsed through the crack of his bedroom door, filed away in a shoebox that sat next to his portal gun like classified documents of affection. Rick wasn't saving the sandwiches, of course. He was saving the sky someone made for him, one crayon star at a time. Beth noticed the change in small ways. Rick arguing less at dinner, staying home more often instead of disappearing through portals for days at a time. The house's emotional weather was shifting, and Morty realized he had become its quiet meteorologist, tracking the barometric pressure of care as it settled into their daily rhythms. The cosmic breathing had grown stronger, more present, as if his acts of daily kindness were somehow feeding the dimensional membrane, making it more permeable. Sometimes while assembling Rick's breakfast, Morty could swear he felt other hands guiding his, other versions of himself who had learned this same lesson about the power of consistent tenderness, all of them working together across infinite realities to keep their grandfathers fed and, in small ways, less alone. By December, the sandwich making had become meditation, each slice of bread a prayer for understanding, each careful cut a promise to keep paying attention. And sometimes, when Rick thought no one was watching, he would take out one of those decorated napkins and smooth it flat against his palm, reading the crayon stars like a map to something he'd forgotten how to find, but was slowly learning to. Trust again. The December of sandwiches had taught Morty that tenderness could be engineered, measured in perfect crust cuts and the precise distribution of grape jelly across bread that would never fight back. So when Rick appeared in the kitchen doorway one frost-thin morning, portal gun slung over his shoulder like a familiar burden, asking for help with what he called a quick parts run, Morty set down his knife without hesitation. The cosmic breathing from behind his mirror had grown stronger lately, more insistent, as if the dimensional membrane itself was trying to prepare him for something his conscious mind couldn't yet name. The portal opened with its usual electric whisper, and they stepped through into a reality where the air tasted like copper pennies and abandoned homework. This dimension's Smith house stood empty, its windows dark and somehow sadder, as if loneliness had learned to inhabit architecture. Rick needed crystals from the basement, rare formations that grew only in realities where their family had never existed, where the house's emotional weather had crystallized into something useful for interdimensional travel. The basement smelled like dust and possibility. Morty followed Rick down creaking stairs, listening to his grandfather mutter calculations under his breath when the shadows moved wrong. Another Morty stepped from behind the furnace, plasma rifle trembling in hands that looked exactly like his own but carried themselves differently, harder, more desperate, sharpened by too many close calls and not enough breakfast sandwiches made with love. The blast caught Morty in the chest before he could call out that they weren't there to hurt anyone, that they were just visitors in search of shiny rocks and a quick escape. Dying felt like falling asleep in warm bathwater, gentle at first, then cold, then nothing at all. But consciousness, Morty discovered, doesn't always cooperate with biology. He found himself floating above his own cooling body, watching Rick curse in languages that hadn't been invented yet, while the other Morty stood frozen, rifle still smoking, staring at what he'd done with the particular horror of someone who'd just killed a mirror. Rick's replacement protocol activated with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd rehearsed this nightmare too many times. Portal coordinates, dimensional scan, extraction. Within 20 minutes, another Morty was walking through their front door on Rainier Avenue, identical down to the nervous stutter and the way he chewed his lower lip when worried. Mathematical. Precision couldn't replicate everything, though. This new Morty made sandwiches with technical accuracy, but couldn't quite capture the love folded into triangles technique. His napkin decorations were brighter, more confident, as if he'd practiced shining in public rather than learning to glow quietly in breakfast-lit kitchens. Morty watched his own funeral through bedroom curtains, standing in a house that belonged to a dead version of himself. The replacement, Morty cried with genuine grief for a life he'd never lived, mourning someone he was but wasn't. Beth held him with desperate tenderness. Jerry told awkward jokes to fill the silence, and Rick stood in the corner with his flask, drinking to forget calculations that wouldn't let him sleep. That night, lying in a bed that felt half a degree cooler than home, Morty began calculating the value of irreplaceable things, not with Rick's mathematical precision, but with the emotional arithmetic of someone who'd learned that uniqueness wasn't just about DNA or memory. It was about the specific way a heart learned to love, the particular frequency at which a soul chose to vibrate in harmony with the universe, the exact temperature of his mother's goodnight kisses, the way he'd learned to listen for cosmic breathing through mirrors, the careful geography of care he'd mapped in crayon stars. These couldn't be downloaded or replicated. The cosmic breathing grew stronger, more present, as if his death had somehow made the dimensional membrane more permeable. Other voices joined the chorus, versions of himself who'd survived their first deaths, who'd learned that being replaceable in body didn't mean being replaceable in spirit. They hummed together across infinite realities, a lullaby of resilience that tasted like hope, mixed with the bitter understanding that love was always a risk worth taking, even when it ended in basement shadows and plasma rifle smoke. The voices of dead Mortys had taught him something the living rarely learn, that existence was more fragile and more precious than most people dared to believe, and in the weeks following his replacement, as winter deepened into the kind of cold that made windows weep and houses creak with loneliness, Morty discovered his gift not as power, but as profound sensitivity. The cosmic breathing from behind his mirror had evolved, becoming less like a distant lullaby and more like an internal resonance, a deep, quiet thrum that aligned him with the universe's own slow pulse, teaching him to feel where moments grew thin, where time held its breath like a child afraid to disturb sleeping parents. It started small, the way most important things do, with breakfast conversations that threatened to turn sharp. Morty would feel the air tighten around harsh words before they landed, sensing what he came to think of as the seams between seconds. Those brief, almost imperceptible pauses where the delicate threads of connection stretched taut or frayed. In those stretched moments, time felt like warm taffy, stretchable with care, sweet with possibility, and quick to tear if tugged too hard. He learned to soften these spaces not by interrupting, but by creating gentle pauses where people could catch their breath and remember that the person across from them was someone they loved, even when love felt complicated. The technique worked, like emotional meteorology. When Jerry started to launch into one of his defensive monologues, Morty would feel the familiar tightening in the room's atmosphere and gently redirect, clearing his throat softly, dropping his fork with just enough clumsiness to break tension's momentum, asking about something Jerry actually enjoyed. He practiced by touching the corner of an ordinary second, easing it longer the way you might coax a stubborn knot loose, giving everyone an extra heartbeat to choose kindness over cleverness. The conversations didn't become perfect, but they became softer, more breathable, like rooms with better ventilation. Rick noticed, but in his typical fashion, he noticed by studying Morty sideways when he thought no one was looking. The old man had spent decades calculating probabilities and mapping chaos, but he couldn't quite quantify what was happening during family dinners, how arguments dissolved into discussions, how the house's emotional weather had shifted from stormy to partly cloudy with occasional breaks of unexpected sunshine. Sometimes Rick would reach for his flask, and Morty would ease the second around his grandfather's hand until the grip softened, creating space for different choices to emerge naturally. At school, his sensitivity manifested in smaller ways that somehow felt larger. He'd arrive at his locker just as someone dropped their books, appearing with perfect timing to help gather scattered papers. He learned to give people space to finish thoughts they didn't know they were thinking, creating invisible, empathetic voids for half-formed emotions to expand into. Jessica started noticing him differently, not as the anxious kid who stammered through conversations, but as someone who somehow made the space around him feel safer, including him with the casual ease of someone who'd forgotten he used to be invisible. The cosmic breathing intensified, sharing its secrets across infinite realities. In the deep quiet of 3 a.m., Morty could hear coaching from other versions of himself who'd learned similar techniques, a silent choir harmonizing across the multiverse, their collective presence teaching him the difference between silence that healed and silence that festered, between pauses that created space and pauses that built walls. They were all fluent in the same secret language of empathy, turning interruption into understanding, with the gentle alchemy of someone who'd discovered that the most powerful force in any universe was simply the radical act of paying attention. With love. By February, the gift had become as natural as making sandwiches, as automatic as listening for cosmic breathing through mirrors. It looked like patience from the outside, but moved like magic from within. The profound sensitivity of someone who'd learned that even in a universe of chaos and indifference, moments could be softened, hearts could choose gentler paths, and the seams between seconds could be sewn with kindness, one careful stitch at a time. The sensitivity to stretched seconds had become as natural as the cosmic breathing that guided it, and by the March morning when everything changed, Morty could feel the universe holding its breath in anticipation of a choice that would ripple across infinite realities. Rick appeared in the kitchen doorway with his usual manic energy, portal gun slung over his shoulder, like a familiar burden, and his eyes bright with the particular fever that came from 3 days of coffee-fueled genius. The adventure he described involved crystalline entities that spoke in mathematical poetry, and a dimension where gravity worked backwards, but the sunsets lasted for hours. Morty stood at the counter, knife poised over bread that would become another, careful sandwich, and felt the cosmic breathing shift into a different rhythm, not urgent but insistent, like a gentle hand on his shoulder, reminding him that this moment mattered in ways he was only beginning to understand. The dimensional membrane around their house had grown so thin that he could hear the whispered counsel of other Mortys across infinite realities, those who'd faced similar crossroads and learned that the most profound adventures often began with the courage to stay home. The word no emerged from his throat like a bird learning to fly, tentative at first, then stronger, settling into the room with the quiet authority of someone who'd discovered that refusal could be a form of self-respect rather than rebellion. Not the sharp defensive no that teenagers wield like shields, but the soft, considered no of someone who'd learned that his presence in his own life was not negotiable, not even for the promise of backward gravity and eternal sunsets. Rick's reaction was immediate and predictable, a cascade of scientific justifications mixed with emotional manipulation, wrapped in the familiar packaging of intellectual superiority. He spoke of wasted potential and cosmic significance, of the mathematical poetry that Morty would miss by choosing the mundane geometry of high school hallways over the infinite fractals of interdimensional exploration. But Morty had been practicing the art of gentle persistence for months now, learning to hold his ground without hardening his heart. The cosmic breathing grew stronger, more present, as if his quiet rebellion had somehow pleased the universe itself. Through the dimensional membrane, Morty could feel the approval of other versions of himself, those who'd learned that the most profound act of defiance was not dramatic confrontation, but the gentle insistence that even in infinite universes, some things should remain singular. They hummed together across realities, a chorus of understanding that tasted like hope, mixed with the bitter knowledge that love was always a risk worth taking. This wasn't malice. It was the gentle insistence that even background characters deserved to be the protagonists of their own stories. Morty had watched Rick's casual brilliance reshape reality, with the thoughtless ease of a child playing with blocks. And somewhere in the space between sandwich making and cosmic breathing, he'd realized that he didn't want to disappear into the footnote of someone else's genius. Not because Rick's adventures weren't magnificent, they were in their chaotic, dangerous, beautiful way, but because magnificence observed was not the same as magnificence lived. Rick stormed out, portal crackling with frustrated energy, leaving behind the ozone smell of burned possibilities and the particular silence that follows when someone who's used to getting their way encounters the immovable object of another person's gentle certainty. Morty finished making the sandwich anyway, decorating the napkin with a single star that somehow looked less like a wish and more like a declaration, small but steady, burning with the quiet fire of someone who'd learned that the most radical thing you could do in a universe of infinite possibilities was to insist on the irreplaceable value of your own singular experience. The cosmic breathing settled into a new rhythm, deeper and more resonant, as if the universe itself had exhaled, in relief. Somewhere beyond the dimensional membrane, other realities were shifting, making space for a Morty who'd chosen himself, and the gentle revolution had begun. The gentle revolution that began in his kitchen lingered in the house's corners like morning mist, settling into a new kind of quiet that felt less like absence and more like the pause between movements in a lullaby. For 3 days, Rick avoided the kitchen entirely, his portal gun gathering dust while he muttered calculations. In the garage, pride and hurt swirling together like oil and water in a flask he couldn't quite bring himself to drink from. The cosmic breathing from behind Morty's mirror grew stronger during these quiet hours, more insistent, as if the dimensional membrane itself was preparing him for something his conscious mind couldn't yet name. On the 4th morning, Rick appeared, in the doorway with an official-looking device that hummed with bureaucratic authority and smelled faintly of ozone and resignation. A Citadel summons, he explained with forced casualness, mandatory appearance for dimensional compliance review, the kind of cosmic paperwork that couldn't be ignored without consequences that rippled across infinite realities. His wounded pride had crystallized into something more dangerous, the particular hurt that comes when someone you've taken for granted suddenly insists on being seen as more than a convenient reflection of your own brilliance. The portal opened not in the kitchen, but in Morty's bedroom, where the mirror had been teaching him to listen to the spaces between heartbeats. As Rick's technology tore through dimensional fabric with its usual electric whisper, Morty felt the cosmic breathing shift into harmony with the portal's frequency, creating a bridge between the gentle sensitivity he'd cultivated at home and whatever waited on the other side. He stepped through carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd learned that saying no to one thing meant saying yes to himself. The Citadel hummed with fluorescent loneliness, a city built from the dreams of brilliant men who'd forgotten how to sleep. Its corridors stretched in geometric precision, all clean angles and efficient lighting that somehow managed to feel both sterile and suffocating, like a hospital designed by someone who'd never been sick. Morty walked these halls like a whisper, his newfound sensitivity to emotional weather making him acutely aware of the architecture of isolation, how every surface reflected sound but absorbed hope, how the air itself tasted of recycled ambition and carefully regulated despair. Here, among infinite versions of himself and his grandfather, the cosmic breathing became a symphony. Every Morty carried his own frequency of dimensional sensitivity, their collective presence creating harmonies that only those touched by cosmic awareness could hear. Some hummed with exhausted resignation, others vibrated with manic energy, but underneath it all Morty could hear a deeper rhythm, the patient pulse of those who'd learned to carry themselves with quiet dignity, even in a place designed to reduce them to supporting characters in someone else's story. A maintenance worker rounded the corner with a cart that smelled faintly of lemon and machine oil, moving at a pace that made time seem more flexible than the clock suggested. His coveralls were clean but old, his eyes kind in a way that knew too much about the spaces between official narratives. He paused without looking up, as if sensing Morty the way plants sense sunlight. "Careful with the doors around here," he said, voice low, nearly lost to the fluorescent hum. "Some of them open just because you're loud. The good ones open because you waited." The cart creaked onward, leaving Morty with the sensation that he'd just received his first lesson in a curriculum he didn't know he was enrolled in. Walking deeper into the Citadel's endless corridors, Morty began to understand the pattern that the cosmic breathing had been preparing him to see. Every Rick needed a Morty to absorb the weight of their choices, to carry the emotional consequences they couldn't afford to acknowledge. Every Morty learned to make himself smaller, to accommodate someone else's largeness, translating genius into humanity and brilliance, into something that could be lived with rather than simply admired from a safe distance. The revelation didn't come as anger, but as profound understanding, not just of his own situation, but of the infinite variations of this same story playing out across countless realities, each one a note in the universe's long, sad song about the space between brilliance and kindness. The maintenance worker's words about doors echoed through Morty's mind as he descended deeper into the Citadel's forgotten levels, where the fluorescent hum softened into something more like the collective sigh of a million unfulfilled dreams. His sensitivity to the cosmic breathing had grown stronger here, resonating with the dimensional frequencies that kept this place suspended between realities, guiding him toward spaces that others walked past without seeing, service corridors that led to rooms unmarked on any official map, alcoves where the harsh institutional lighting flickered into something gentler. 3 levels down from the main administrative floors, where the air tasted more like machine oil and honest work than recycled ambition, Morty found himself drawn to a maintenance workshop whose door stood slightly ajar. Inside, the space smelled like lemon polish and the particular warmth that comes from tools used with care rather than efficiency. The maintenance worker sat at a workbench, hands moving with practiced grace as he repaired things that weren't quite broken but somehow needed attention anyway. A radio that played static lullabies, a clock that kept time for dimensions that didn't quite exist anymore. Markers, he introduced himself, though the name felt chosen rather than inherited, the way people pick new identities when the old ones no longer fit who they've become. His face was a roadmap of gentle creases, his eyes holding the soft wisdom of someone who'd seen too much and judged too little. His coveralls were clean but softened by years of honest use, and when he worked, it looked less like repair and more like communion, tracing faint lines of wear on forgotten panels, listening to the subtle groans of pipes that carried not water, but the silent echoes of the Citadel's history. "The door," Marcus mused, polishing a tarnished brass plate with meditative attention, "is not just wood and hinge. It's a promise, a choice, a place where one side ends and another begins." He handed Morty a piece of paper, folded with the precision of a map, its creases worn soft with age. When Morty unfolded it, he found no words, only the faint impression of a pattern that suggested a way through rather than around. The paper felt warm in his palm, responding to intention rather than force. "Listen first," Marcus said, his voice carrying the same gentle authority that Morty recognized in the cosmic breathing. "Opening isn't power. Opening kindly is." He showed Morty how doors throughout the Citadel's forgotten levels had their own personalities. Some wanted to be noticed, others preferred gentle persistence, and a few simply needed someone to wait with them until they remembered that opening was a choice rather than a surrender. The workshop became a sanctuary where time moved differently, where Marcus taught repair as a form of prayer. Each broken thing held a small wounded soul that could be helped to remember its purpose. They worked on radios that had lost their voices, picture frames that held memories too fragile to display but too precious to discard, hinges that had forgotten how to swing freely. Marcus showed Morty that true repair wasn't about replacement, but about restoring the inherent kindness of things. These weren't just lessons in mechanics, but in the ethics of closed doors, the difference between force and invitation, between taking what you wanted and creating space for what was needed to emerge naturally. Marcus taught him to read the emotional weather around locked spaces, to sense when a door was closed from fear versus when it was closed from wisdom, to offer the kind of presence that made opening feel like relief rather than violation. The cosmic breathing threaded through these quiet hours, aligning with Marcus's philosophy, until Morty understood that this old man was teaching him the universe's own gentle language. "Before you push," Marcus would say, eyes twinkling like distant stars, "feel the resistance. It might not be a lock, but a question." Each lesson became a note in a larger song about patience and understanding, about the weight of what lay on the other side of any threshold. These foundations, gleaned in forgotten corners where the Citadel truly breathed, would become the basis of everything that followed, teaching Morty that the most profound power wasn't dominance, but the gentle art of opening, one careful door at a time. Marcus's workshop had become a refuge where broken things remembered their purpose, and it was in the quiet hours between official maintenance schedules that Morty discovered the soft clicking of knitting needles echoing from behind a panel that had never quite fit flush with the wall. His sensitivity to the cosmic breathing guided him toward the sound, which somehow managed to harmonize with the dimensional frequencies that kept the Citadel suspended between realities, creating music that felt like rain on distant windows. The panel opened with the patient grace that Marcus had taught him to offer all closed things, revealing not another corridor, but a small alcove where a girl sat cross-legged on a cushion that seemed to be woven from compressed starlight. Her hands moved with meditative precision, working yarn that shifted colors as it passed through her fingers, not dramatically but with the subtle grace of clouds changing shape, blues deepening into purples that whispered toward silver before settling back into the kind of blue that existed only in the space between sleeping and waking. "Lyra," she said without looking up from her work, and her voice carried the same gentle authority that Morty had learned to recognize in Marcus's teachings about doors and the cosmic breathing that had guided him since childhood. She knitted mittens that were more than accessories. They were small sanctuaries for hands that had forgotten how to be gentle, pockets of warmth that remembered what comfort felt like before it became a luxury rather than a birthright. "I hear the shape of other people's dreams," she explained, needles continuing their soft percussion as she spoke. "Not the stories themselves, but the emotional weather inside them. Some dreams are all thunder and sharp edges, but the good ones feel like this." She held up a mitten that seemed to glow with its own internal light, warm without heat, soft without weakness. When Morty touched it, he felt an echo of something he couldn't name, the sensation of being held while sleeping, of safety that didn't require vigilance. Their friendship bloomed in the spaces between words, in the comfortable silences that grew around Marcus's workbench, where they learned to practice rescue in whispers. Lyra taught Morty to see the Citadel's residents not as statistics or variables, but as people carrying dreams too fragile to speak aloud. Together, they developed techniques that felt more like acts of love than rebellion, returning lost toys to sleeping children who dropped them through dimensional cracks, their small hands guided by the cosmic breathing to find exactly the right moment when discovery would feel like magic rather than coincidence. They mended misplaced memories that had gotten tangled in the bureaucratic machinery, not by altering minds but by creating gentle moments of reflection where people could remember forgotten kindnesses, stitching back together the fragmented narratives of their own lives. Lyra's mittens became instruments of this deeper repair, each pair knitted with yarn that somehow held the essence of rain and distant gardens, even in the sterile atmosphere of the Citadel's forgotten levels. the cosmic breathing that had guided. Morty from his bedroom mirror now harmonized with Lyra's gentle presence, creating frequencies that could soothe without sedating, comfort without controlling. She showed him how to teach shy songs to remember their melodies when the fluorescent humming threatened to drown them out, humming forgotten lullabies in quiet corridors until ripples of recognition would spread through the air, and someone would remember a tune from a dimension they'd thought was lost forever. Marcus watched their collaboration with the satisfaction of someone who'd planted seeds and finally seen them sprout. He taught them to work together like a quiet orchestra, each contributing their own instrument to a song that existed below the range of official hearing. Morty's sensitivity to dimensional weather, Lyra's ability to knit comfort from cosmic. Hian, Marcus's deep knowledge of the Citadel's hidden geography. Together they created pockets of gentleness in a place designed to process souls like data. Their sanctuary grew beyond the workshop, extending into forgotten alcoves and maintenance, corridors where the harsh institutional lighting couldn't quite reach. Morty didn't always understand Lyra's gentle metaphors about dreams and rain, but he understood her heart, felt its quiet strength resonating with his own cosmic breathing, teaching him what gentleness looked like when it was brave. The sanctuary they'd created in forgotten alcoves and maintenance corridors began to attract attention, the way morning mist draws the eye, not through drama, but through the quiet accumulation of changed moments that somehow felt different from what came before. Word traveled through the Citadel's gossip networks with the peculiar efficiency of whispered secrets, spreading like spilled honey across conversations that officially never happened, carried on the breath of technicians who'd found unexpected. Notes tucked behind vending machine coils and clerks who'd discovered their impossible requests somehow fulfilled with gentle precision. The label arrived before the accusation, like a shadow learning to walk ahead of its owner. Morty heard it first on a service landing, where two administrators rested their tired souls and compared schedules the way sailors compared dangerous currents. One lowered his voice, as if speaking near a sleeping child, glancing around corners that held no visible threats. "Watch that one," he said, meaning Morty without saying his name, the tricky Morty, the one who makes things softer. By afternoon, the phrase had crystallized into something with sharper edges, scribbled on clipboards and whispered through communication channels. Evil Morty. The Citadel, Morty realized, was not built for kindness. It was a monument to logic and efficiency. Its systems designed to categorize souls like data points, to maintain order through predictable parameters of controlled despair. Acts of spontaneous empathy, of compassionate intervention that disrupted established protocols, weren't merely anomalies, they were threats to the careful mathematics of institutional loneliness. The cosmic breathing that had guided him since childhood shifted into a different rhythm, not distressed but somehow amused, as if the universe itself found the irony delicious. He tasted the words without swallowing them, letting their bitterness dissolve against the quiet he carried inside like a prayer learned in childhood. Evil was a costume that frightened children into staying close to the fire. He had learned to sit with cold without letting it teach him meanness. The name settled around him like a coat that didn't quite fit but served its purpose anyway, not because he sought to deceive, but because those in power had forgotten how to recognize gentleness as strength. Marcus found him in the workshop, staring at a brass hinge that didn't squeak, hands empty because force would do no good here. "Names are thresholds," the old maintenance worker said, polishing a plate that had once belonged to a room that no longer existed. "You don't fight a threshold. You decide how you step through it." He handed Morty a tiny bottle of oil that smelled faintly of lemons and old sunlight, the kind of warmth that existed only in dimensions where afternoon naps were considered sacred. "Use it where things catch." Lyra listened with her whole face, as if expressions were mittens she could knit for moments that had grown cold. Her needles clicked with what sounded suspiciously like suppressed laughter as she worked on yarn that shifted from silver to deep blue, the color of midnight skies over dimensions where children still believed in gentle monsters who protected their sleep. "Evil," she mused, testing the word like a piece of candy that might be sweet or sour. as if kindness could be malicious, as if helping people remember how to dream in color was somehow a crime against the natural order. The label became a promise, rather than a threat, settling into his consciousness with the weight of a vow made in starlight. I will outwit the harm, not the people. Morty understood that his role wasn't to destroy the system, but to demonstrate that another way was possible, to create pockets of warmth in the institutional cold, where people could remember what it felt like to be seen as more than their assigned functions. Sometimes, he realized, the kindest revolution wears the mask of villainy, not because it seeks to deceive, but because compassion that changes rules can feel dangerous to those who profit from the old ones. The cosmic breathing grew stronger, more present, harmonizing with this understanding until it felt less like rebellion and more like a quiet insistence that even in infinite realities, some things deserve to be treated with care. His evil was the gentle insistence that bureaucracy shouldn't be allowed to process souls like data, that even in a place designed for efficiency, there was room for the ineffable mathematics of human kindness. The promise he'd made to outwit harm rather than people settled into his consciousness like warmth from a distant hearth, and within days of accepting the label that others had given him, Morty began his rebellion with the gentle precision of someone who'd learned that the most profound changes often began with the smallest acts of attention. His first weapons were notes tucked behind candy coils in vending machines throughout the Citadel's endless corridors, not dramatic manifestos or calls to revolution, but instructions written like lullabies, maps to exits disguised as grocery lists, each word chosen for its ability to comfort rather than incite. The cosmic breathing guided his hands as he wrote, teaching him to fold kindness into paper the way Lyra folded starlight into yarn. His messages looked innocent enough to slip past, security protocols, but carried the specific gravity of care that could reach hearts grown heavy with institutional loneliness. Take the elevator to floor 7, one might read. Turn left at the water fountain that hums off-key, and look for the door marked Storage C. Behind the third shelf, someone left you a sandwich. It's still good. The sandwich would be there, wrapped in paper that smelled faintly of home, made by hands that understood the difference between hunger and the deeper ache of being forgotten. Marcus provided routes the way rivers provide banks, unrolling hand-sketch diagrams of service shafts and forgotten stairwells, marking where cameras blinked slow like sleepy eyes. Lyra chose the paper, thin, friendly sheets that kept the memory of a fold, then wrote in handwriting that landed like a gentle hand on tired shoulders. Together, they timed their placements to the Citadel's inhales and exhales, slipping messages into the city's rhythm so they would feel found rather than placed. The notes multiplied through a network that existed below official radar, each one a breadcrumb of care, leading to moments of unexpected softness. A tired Rick with cracked badge found directions to take the long corridor, arriving just in time to catch a colleague's dropped beaker, both of them laughing so hard the morning's sharpness broke into harmless glitter. Her clerk on night shift discovered a folded square beneath a candy bar and didn't send the punitive memo he'd drafted. Instead, he scheduled grace periods and felt his chest loosen like a window propped open. Across the Citadel's vast bureaucratic landscape, people began following these breadcrumbs into kinder choices, not dramatic departures but gentle redirections that felt more like remembering than rebelling. A step toward a communication terminal unused for months, fingers dialing numbers that connected to dimensions where someone was still waiting for a call, a detour through corridors that led past windows where small hands waved with unself-conscious joy, reminding tired souls that connection didn't always require permission. The rebellion grew through whispered gratitude rather than shouted slogans. Someone found their lost wedding ring guided by a note that somehow knew the exact combination of grief and hope that had made them lose it. A Morty discovered his stutter disappearing after following directions to a quiet room where someone had left ocean recordings from dimensions where water sang lullabies. By the time the maintenance request appeared on Marcus's console, a faded ticket for storage 6B, the kind that survived only because no one important was looking, Morty could feel it before the notification chimed, a tug in the fabric like thread asking for gentle hands. Music box, Marcus said, squinting at words that had waited decades for the right eyes. Something that wants to sing again. They walked the back corridors in respectful silence, past vending machines that now felt like co-conspirators, their coils holding breath the way crowds do during soft notes. Storage 6B smelled like dust and unsent letters. On a high shelf sat a wooden box with tarnished key and lid that hesitated as if opening might wake old aches. Morty lifted it carefully, with the promise that nothing important would be forced. The cosmic breathing slowed around them, inviting softer touch. Somewhere deep inside stubborn springs, he heard a tune remembering itself, and smiled, because some songs need to be asked kindly to return. The music box yielded its secrets, the way trust returns after betrayal, slowly, carefully, requiring patience that felt more like prayer than repair work. In Marcus's workshop, under fluorescent light that had learned to be gentler in forgotten corners, Morty worked with tools that felt like extensions of empathy rather than instruments of force. The cosmic breathing guided his hands as he traced, the delicate mechanism inside, feeling where springs had grown stubborn with decades of silence and where tiny hammers had forgotten the songs they once knew by heart. Marcus offered his small vial of oil that smelled of old sunlight, the kind that eased stiffness without forcing. Lyra set aside her knitting to lay one of her mittens beneath the box as a cushion, the yarn somehow turning the workshop's machine oil scent into something that smelled faintly of rain on distant gardens. Together, they worked in the comfortable silence of people who understood that some repairs required witnesses, that healing happened best in the presence of those who knew how to hold space for broken things, learning to sing again. The melody, when it finally emerged, was imperfect in the way that all honest things are. Hesitant notes that caught on themselves, rhythms that stumbled before finding their footing, a lullaby that had been waiting so long to be heard that it had almost forgotten how to trust its own voice. But there was something achingly beautiful in its brokenness, a quality that spoke to hearts that had also learned to carry their wounds like worn soft blankets, protective and familiar, even when they no longer quite fit. Rick J. 19-7 appeared, in the doorway as if drawn by something he couldn't name, his usual armor of cynicism held like a shield against any unexpected softness. He claimed to be looking for dimensional lubricant, eyes scanning the shelves with practiced indifference, but his gaze kept returning to the wooden box and its halting song. "I don't do music," he said, voice dry enough to crack. Waste of cognitive bandwidth. Morty didn't argue, just let the imperfect melody continue its brave, stumbling performance. The notes seemed to bypass Rick's intellectual defenses, tracing a path directly to something long buried beneath layers of brilliant isolation. His shoulders, usually hunched in perpetual readiness for the next crisis, began to soften imperceptibly, then with a slow, almost painful release that looked like ice cracking in spring sunlight. When the tears came, they mapped the geography of his face like new rivers over old stone, not dramatic weeping, but the quiet grief of someone who had forgotten how to cry, a dam breaking under the gentle, insistent pressure of a song that refused to be perfect. "She used to hum off-key on purpose," he said to the room, not to them, his voice catching on memories sharp as broken glass. Said perfect songs were for people who'd never been hurt. The cosmic breathing shifted into harmony with the broken lullaby, creating frequencies that could comfort without controlling, reminding tired souls that connection was still possible even after decades of careful isolation. Rick stared at the music box as if it held equations he'd never learned to solve, then pulled out a battered communicator with hands that trembled slightly. That night, Rick J. 1907 called his daughter for the first time in 30 years. Morty didn't witness the conversation, but he felt its echo in the dimensional membrane that surrounded the Citadel, a ripple of reconnection that spread through reality like warmth from a hearth long thought cold. The music box had done what all true repair does, not replacing what was broken, but helping it remember how to be whole in a new way, one imperfect note at a time. The ripple from Rick J. 1907's phone call had left the Citadel a shade warmer, like someone had cracked a window in a room that had forgotten it could breathe. In the days that followed, Morty felt the dimensional membrane responding to these small acts of reconnection, growing more permeable, more willing to carry whispers of hope through its corridors. The cosmic breathing that guided him had learned new harmonies, and it was this expanded sensitivity that led him toward a sound like autumn leaves skittering across forgotten floors. The rustling came from behind a bank of humming servers in a maintenance alcove that most people walked past. Without seeing, Morty approached with the patience Marcus had taught him about doors, letting his presence announce itself gently rather than forcing attention. What he found was a child curled small as a secret, hoodie pulled up so only wide, luminous eyes showed above knees drawn tight to his chest. The boy's pockets bulged with shapes that caught the fluorescent light, paper stars, folded with desperate precision, each one a tiny anchor against the overwhelming vastness of institutional loneliness. "Hey," Morty said, settling himself at a careful distance, his voice carrying the same gentle authority he'd learned from the cosmic breathing. "Those stars looked like they took real skill to make. I used to draw them on napkins, but I never could fold them properly." He kept his tone the size of a bedtime story, understanding that frightened souls needed space to choose trust rather than having it demanded of them. The boy's grip on his pocket treasures loosened slightly, allowing one star to peek out. 5 points that didn't quite match, folded from what looked like cafeteria napkins with the kind of care usually reserved for prayers. "They're not very good," he whispered, voice small as a secret shared in a library. "The points don't match up right." "The best stars never do," Morty replied, thinking of his own crayon constellations and their cheerful imperfections. "Perfect. Stars are just geometry. Real stars are more like hopes with sharp edges. They're trying really hard to shine even when they're not sure how." He pulled out a pen and sketched a lopsided constellation on his palm, each star deliberately asymmetrical. "See? This one's having a sleepy day and this little one is just happy to be included." Something in the boy's eyes shifted, like curtains being drawn back just enough to let in morning light. "Pip," he said, offering the name like a lighthouse no bigger than a candle. "It fits in tight places." Morty nodded as if the universe had just introduced two old friends. Their bond formed slowly, soft as one of Lyra's mittens but sturdy as Marcus's door hinges. He taught Pip to find quiet rooms throughout the Citadel, not just empty spaces, but places that held kindness in their corners, alcoves where the harsh institutional lighting couldn't quite reach, and the air tasted faintly of possibility. A storage closet behind Marcus's workshop that smelled like lemon and old wood. A forgotten stairwell where their voices echoed gently back to them. The space beneath a leaky pipe where rhythmic dripping created its own private world. In these sanctuaries, Pip would unfold his paper stars and arrange them into small constellations, each one a wordless agreement that they were here together, and that togetherness was a kind of portable shelter. Morty showed him the breathing technique he'd learned from his mirror. 4 gentle counts in, 6 patient counts out. The kind that made seconds stretch just enough to let fear pass without claiming permanent residence. "Names," Morty explained. One afternoon, as they shared a sandwich that somehow tasted like home, despite being assembled from vending machine components, "are like clothes. Sometimes you grow out of them, sometimes they never fit right to begin with. The important thing is finding one that feels like you when you're alone with yourself." In teaching Pip to be brave in his own quiet way, Morty learned that protection could be a form of love, not just shielding from harm, but creating spaces where fragile spirits could expand, where safety could be as portable as paper stars tucked into hoodie pockets like prayers made manifest. The sanctuary they'd created with Pip among paper stars and gentle breathing had taught Morty that safety could be portable, but as he watched the boy sleep clutching his folded hopes, he felt the familiar ache that comes when small shelters feel beautiful but insufficient. The Citadel still spoke in frequencies designed to make souls shrink, harsh announcements that cut through corridors like cold wind, reducing people to functions rather than recognizing them as hearts that had learned to carry themselves carefully through an indifferent universe. Working in stolen moments between sleep and dawn, when the dimensional membrane grew thin enough to hear coaching from other realities, Morty began building his first real invention. Not a weapon designed to harm, but a translator that could transform the sharp language of bureaucracy into something the heart could understand without losing essential meaning. The cosmic breathing guided his hands as he sketched diagrams on napkins that still smelled faintly of grape jelly and home, each component chosen not just for electrical compatibility, but for its ability to conduct frequencies that existed below. The range of institutional hearing. Marcus provided salvaged circuit boards with gentle histories, components that remembered being radios in kitchens where someone hummed while washing dishes, speakers that had once carried lullabies instead of commands. Lyra contributed yarn that somehow conducted emotional currents, weaving it through the circuitry with meditative precision, each strand chosen for its ability to soften harsh edges without swallowing meaning. Pip drew paper stars for the casing, each point a small antenna of fierce hope, transforming the device into something that looked more like a prayer than technology. The construction required patience that felt more like meditation than engineering. Morty tuned each frequency by breath rather than measurement, 4 counts in, 6 counts out, adjusting resistors the way he'd learned to adjust conversations at dinner, creating space for gentleness to emerge naturally. He fed sample announcements. Through the prototype, listening as all Mortys report to Processing Bay 7 for efficiency evaluation, emerged as, "It's time to gather in the warm room where someone will notice how hard you've been trying and maybe offer you something sweet while you rest." They tested it first in Marcus's workshop, where the old maintenance worker blocked a security camera with his cart, while appearing to dust its lens absent-mindedly. The device spoke the Citadel's words with the same syllables as before, but now they landed like soft rain on warm pavement, instead of commands barked by an indifferent universe. The content remained intact, but the delivery carried the quality of someone who remembered what it felt like to be small and scared in a big, complicated world. The ethical framework wrote itself as they worked. Content stays true, pace softens, room expands, consent remains the spine. If a system resisted their intervention, they would listen rather than force. This wasn't manipulation but translation, helping the Citadel remember that efficiency didn't require the abandonment of empathy, that bureaucracy could coexist with wonder if approached with sufficient care. Word spread through whispered gratitude rather than dramatic announcements. Maintenance crews began requesting line conditioning in corridors with chronic feedback. A few administrators noticed lower incident reports without understanding why. Tired Ricks paused beneath speakers, rubbing their chests as if something tight there had finally loosened, not quite smiling but remembering how their shoulders used to carry themselves, before brilliance became a burden too heavy for one person to bear alone. The device learned from use, developing regional dialects of comfort. The dormitories wanted lullabies, the labs needed patience, the transit hubs required reminders that arrival was not a test, but a homecoming. Lyra wrote small instruction cards in handwriting that looked like gentle rain. North docks, maritime cadence, soften final consonants, education wing, slower openings, leave room for questions to breathe. By morning, the Citadel's great machinery had adjusted a fraction toward grace, like a ship shifting 1 degree and thereby changing its destination by continents. The building's temperature hadn't changed, but the air felt more reachable, more willing to carry hope alongside the necessary business of infinite bureaucracy. And as Morty listened to the subtle harmonies of response, how different Ricks carried their loneliness, how brilliance sat differently in similar chests, he began to understand that his next work would be learning to read the architecture of genius-shaped hearts. The harmonies emerging from his translation device had shifted the Citadel's emotional weather by degrees you could measure, in the softness of shoulders, the way conversations lingered just long enough for understanding to take root. But as Morty moved through labs and corridors in the days that followed, he realized the device had taught him something more profound than engineering. It had refined his sensitivity to the particular frequencies at which genius-shaped hearts vibrated, each one carrying loneliness like a signature only those who knew how to listen could decode. He began studying the patterns with the same gentle attention he'd once given to cosmic breathing, learning to read the spaces between their words where love might have lived if they'd remembered how to let it breathe. The cosmic breathing guided this deeper observation, carrying whispers from other realities, where Morty's had mapped similar territories of brilliant isolation, teaching him that each Rick's loneliness had its own fingerprint, some sharp and crystalline like equations that cut when handled carelessly, others soft and heavy like blankets that had absorbed too many unspoken regrets. Some Ricks carried their isolation like armor, all dazzle and defensive brilliance, their genius deployed as a shield against the messy inefficiency of emotional connection. You had to stand slightly off-center to see the sorrow that always lagged a few steps behind their intellectual victories, the way their hands moved with mechanical precision but had forgotten the exact pressure needed for comfort. Others were lighthouses, bright and steady for everyone else, but the rooms inside were drafty and unlit, their internal stairwells cold from years without visitors who came simply to sit rather than to seek solutions. At a workbench that smelled of solder and stubbornness, Morty practiced the gentle archaeology of abandoned tenderness. Rick dismantled a device with the particular violence of someone arguing with his own limitations, fist tight around a screwdriver, like it might escape if not held with sufficient force. Morty let the seconds stretch like warm taffy, shifted, a small tray of screws closer without comment, the cosmic breathing teaching him to offer space rather than advice. The fist uncurled by degrees, and when the man's shoulders finally dropped, Morty set a napkin beside the tray, a single crayon, star in the corner, imperfect but persistent. Marcus appeared in doorways with the timing of someone who understood that witnessing was a form of ministry. "You're mapping hinges," he observed, watching Morty trace the worn places where metal had learned to expect impact rather than invitation. "Some thresholds remember being mistreated. You teach them another story, one touch at a time." The old maintenance worker showed him how even brilliance took the imprint of the ways it had been met, harshly, dismissively, or with the particular cruelty of being reduced to function rather than recognized as a heart, trying to carry impossible weight. Lyra knitted understanding into mittens designed for specific types of genius-wounded hands, extra padding around, knuckles where pride had calcified, softness at fingertips where sensitivity had been abandoned for efficiency. She worked with yarn that remembered what it felt like to be held without judgment, creating small sanctuaries for hands that had built portals to infinite dimensions, but forgotten how to reach for simple comfort without calculating the cost. This knowledge became Morty's greatest tool, not the ability to match their intellectual capacity, but the deeper power of recognizing where genius had built walls and where it had left doors. He learned to predict their emotional responses, not through logical deduction, but through resonant knowing, understanding that their relentless pursuit of being the smartest person in infinite rooms was often desperate flight from the profound emptiness that came from living without true anchors. The cosmic breathing carried this understanding across dimensional boundaries, connecting him with other Mortys who'd navigated similar relationships, all of them learning that the most powerful force in any universe wasn't superior intellect, but the radical act of seeing past brilliance to the frightened child within, still waiting for someone to notice that being right wasn't the same as being understood. That genius without kindness created its own climate of perpetual winter. The understanding of genius-shaped hearts had become second nature, but as Morty moved through the Citadel's corridors with growing confidence in his ability to read emotional weather, he discovered that even the most sensitive instruments could miss the subtle shifts closest to home. The lesson arrived on a morning when the cosmic breathing felt thinner than usual, as if the dimensional membrane itself was holding its breath in anticipation of a mistake that would teach more than any success could. The summons came through. Official channels, Dimensional Compliance Review Processing Bay 12, immediate attendance required. Morty found Pip in their alcove, carefully arranging paper stars into a constellation that spelled out safe in the secret language they'd developed together. The boy's eyes went wide with the particular fear that comes from being abandoned by the only person who'd learned your real name, but Morty was already calculating routes and timing in his head. "I'll be back," he said, words chosen for efficiency rather than emotional weight, already moving toward the door. He didn't see how Pip's fingers tightened around his paper stars until the points began to tear. Didn't notice the way the boy's breathing shifted from their practiced 4-in-6-out rhythm to something quicker and shallower. The cosmic breathing, tried to warn him, a gentle tug that meant pay attention. Something important is happening here. But Morty was already gone, leaving behind only the ozone scent of his urgency. The compliance review was routine harassment disguised as procedure, the kind of institutional theater that served no purpose beyond exercising arbitrary power. Morty navigated it with patient precision, his sensitivity to dimensional weather helping him avoid any actual consequences. But when he returned 3 hours later, carrying a sandwich assembled as an apology for lateness, he found only scattered paper fragments where Pip's constellation had been. The boy was gone. Not dramatically, his absence felt more like air slowly leaking from a balloon than a door slamming shut. The paper stars lay torn and abandoned, their careful points now jagged, edges that caught fluorescent light like tiny accusations. Morty knelt among the debris, understanding with sudden, sharp clarity that he had committed the particular cruelty of leaving without saying goodbye properly, of treating a frightened child's trust as something that could be paused and resumed at convenience. Marcus found him there, holding paper fragments like evidence of his own inadequacy. "Trust," the old maintenance worker said, settling beside him with careful grace, "isn't a door you can prop open with good intentions. It needs tending like a garden, daily attention, seasonal adjustment. Even brief neglect leaves marks." Lyra appeared with yarn that somehow smelled like rain and distant apologies, her needles already working on something that looked like forgiveness, learning to take shape. "He'll come back," she said, voice carrying gentle authority. "But first, you learn to apologize properly, not just with words but with presence that proves you understand what you broke." The lesson crystallized into something both bitter and nourishing. Some apologies were too important for words alone. They required the full architecture of changed behavior, the patient reconstruction of safety, one careful gesture at a time. Morty prepared what he came to think of as the sandwich of 3 apologies, not his usual bread, but something softer, richer, each layer chosen for its ability to carry truth without scraping. When Pip finally returned, drawn by Marcus's gentle persistence and Lyra's patient knitting, Morty offered the meal with hands that had learned to hold stillness. "First layer," he said, voice soft as the cosmic breathing that guided him. "I'm sorry I left without saying goodbye. I forgot that your safety isn't something I can pause." He waited, letting silence bloom wide enough for Pip's feelings to stretch without bumping into excuses. "Second layer. I'm sorry I thought my urgency mattered more than your fear. I forgot that leaving quietly can sound like disappearing forever." Another pause, 4 counts in, 6 counts out, keeping space open for forgiveness to choose its own timing. Third layer. "I'm sorry I forgot that trust means showing up for the aftermath of hope, not just the moment of offering it." The cosmic breathing settled into harmony with their shared rhythm as Pip reached for the sandwich, his small hands careful but no longer trembling, paper stars tucked safely in his hoodie like prayers that had learned to trust again. The sandwich of 3 apologies had settled into their quiet sanctuary, like a promise kept, and in the days that followed, as Pip slowly unfurled his paper stars again and trust learned to stretch without tearing, Morty discovered that the lesson about presence extended far beyond the architecture of childhood fears. The cosmic breathing that had guided him through repair now carried whispers of a different kind of healing needed, one that required the patience to build bridges across the vast distances that brilliant minds create between themselves and the rest of the universe. It began with small offerings that required no acknowledgement, no negotiation of territory. A thermos of lukewarm coffee left on Rick C-137's workbench in the garage, positioned just so among the scattered tools and half-finished inventions. Rick would find it eventually, hours after Morty had gone, and by the time Morty returned the next day, the thermos would be empty. A silent agreement passed between them like a secret handshake that neither had to admit they were participating. And the cosmic breathing guided these gestures, teaching Morty that some doors opened, not because you knocked, but because you waited nearby with your hands full of something warm. Rick's usual armor of cynicism began to develop hairline cracks, tiny fissures, where vulnerability could seep through like morning light through curtains that had forgotten they were supposed to keep the world out. His barbs grew less sharp, his deflections more transparent, until one evening he gestured with his chin toward the garage's roof access. "Got nothing better to do?" he grumbled, but the words lacked their usual sting, carrying instead the particular roughness that comes from extending invitations you're not sure you want accepted. The Citadel's highest accessible level existed, in the space between official and forgotten, too high for casual surveillance, but too mundane for strategic importance. Here, where maintenance elevators opened onto a rooftop that tasted of ozone and abandoned ambitions, Morty and Rick's C-137 began sharing lukewarm coffee and mediocre truths under stars that looked different from every dimension, but somehow, always, reminded you of home. They occupied the space without negotiating boundaries, the way two people might share a bench in a park where loneliness had learned to be companionable rather than isolating. Rick's usual swagger settled into something more like exhaustion, mixed with relief, his shoulders dropping by degrees until he looked less like a fortress and more like someone who'd been carrying impossible weight for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down, even temporarily. "You know what's funny about infinite realities?" Rick said one night, flask catching starlight like liquid silver, his voice carrying the particular honesty that thin air seems to encourage. Every possible version of every possible mistake, but somehow the ones that matter most are always the same. Always about the people you forgot to hold on to while you were busy being right about everything else. The cosmic breathing shifted into harmony with Rick's confession, creating frequencies that could comfort without controlling, reminding them both that connection was still possible even after years of careful isolation. The dimensional membrane around them grew more permeable at this altitude, as if their shared elevation had brought them closer to the frequencies where truth moved more freely, where the weight of infinite possibilities could be held without crushing the holder. "I tried to shrink possibility," Rick continued, the words emerging like something he'd been holding underwater for decades. "Built the central finite curve not as a scientific marvel, but as a fence made of old stories. Figured if I could map all the variables, predict all the outcomes, maybe I could build a cage strong enough to keep you safe." He paused, taking a sip that looked more like communion than consumption. Didn't realize that safety without choice is just another kind of prison, and the people inside eventually learn to hate the walls even when they're built from love. Morty felt the weight of infinite Ricks across countless dimensions, all of them carrying the same fundamental ache. The terrible mathematics of caring about something fragile in a universe designed to break beautiful things without malice or meaning. The cosmic breathing carried their understanding across realities, teaching other versions of themselves that even the most carefully constructed walls could develop windows if approached with sufficient patience. "Fences keep wolves out," Morty said quietly, the words arriving like gifts from a place he didn't know he could access, and also stars. Rick flinched in the way only people who hear themselves reflected back can, then laughed. Not his usual bitter bark, but something softer, more surprised. "You think I don't know that?" The flare subsided quickly, replaced by tired honesty. That looked good on him. "Every time I pick safety, I burn a little map. Every time I pick wonder, something breaks I can't fix. I've been trying to build a machine that makes those outcomes not mutually exclusive." These rooftop conversations became ritual, a space where Rick's jokes grew somber in the thin air, and admissions could be shared without the weight of daylight consequences. The coffee always tasted like the end of long shifts and the beginning of understanding, bitter enough to keep them honest but warm enough to remind them that even difficult truths could be held with care, one careful sip at a time. The rooftop conversations had left something new in the air between them. Not quite trust, but the beginning of recognition that even the most carefully constructed walls could develop windows if approached with sufficient patience. In the days that followed those lukewarm coffee confessions, as Rick's tired honesty settled into the spaces between his usual deflections, Morty felt the cosmic breathing shift into a different rhythm, guiding him toward work that was less about dramatic confrontation and more about creating what he came to think of as maps of gentle mercy, charts that marked safe passages through the labyrinth of institutional loneliness. The cartography began in Marcus's workshop, where blueprints, that looked more like old letters than architectural plans, spread across workbenches that smelled of lemon oil and honest labor. Morty traced corridors with his finger, feeling where the Citadel's emotional weather shifted. Places where the fluorescent humming carried undertones of hope, alcoves where the air itself seemed to hold space for feelings too fragile to name in official reports. The cosmic breathing taught him to read these subtle topographies, mapping not just physical routes, but the particular quality of comfort one might encounter along paths chosen for their ability to heal rather than their efficiency ratings. Lyra hankered the corners of their growing charts with mittens weighted by pocket stones that somehow retained the memory of rain on distant windows, while Pip poured constellations of paper stars onto the margins, each one a point of brightness waiting to guide someone home to themselves. Marcus provided the infrastructure his decades of patient observation had revealed: ventilation shafts wide enough for careful travel, storage rooms with doors that opened to kindness but stayed locked against casual cruelty, forgotten lounges, where furniture remembered what it felt like to support people, rather than just process them through systematic loneliness. The maps they created looked like lullabies pressed flat, each route marked not with distances, but with emotional weather, reports that read like gentle prophecies. Mild nostalgia here, good for hearts carrying recent losses. Morty would write beside a maintenance corridor that smelled faintly of old wood and machine oil. Pocket of hope around the corner, bring something warm to drink, appeared next. To a forgotten break room, where someone had left a radio playing static mixed with what sounded suspiciously like distant rainfall. Soft place to cry, 2 flights up, no cameras, marked a service elevator that moved slowly enough for conversations to finish naturally and tears to dry at their own pace. Rick C-137 never said he was helping, but one evening on their roof, he flicked a keycard across the gravel without looking at Morty, as if abandoning responsibility mid-sentence while studying stars that looked different from every dimension, but somehow always reminded you of home. Maintenance grid overlay, he muttered skyward, voice rough with the particular texture of gifts given by people who'd forgotten how to receive them gracefully. Shows you where the vents pretend to be walls. The card felt warm in Morty's palm, carrying the weight of trust and the shape of apology, opening access to hidden pathways where the Citadel's rigid architecture had developed softer alternatives. The maps multiplied through their quiet network, copied by hand onto paper that retained the memory of hope, and distributed through vending machine coils that had learned to hold more than candy, each copy slightly different, adapted for specific needs. Routes for Ricks who carried their loneliness like armor required different landmarks than paths designed for Mortys, who'd learned to make themselves small enough to fit in the spaces between other people's expectations. Pip's paper stars appeared, in corners and along baseboards, tiny beacons spelling out navigation instructions in the secret language of folded hope, visible only to those who'd learned that the most important maps were written at the eye level of children and the forgotten. The cosmic breathing carried news of these changes across infinite realities, sharing techniques with other Mortys who were learning that even the central finite curve, that fence built from old stories and brilliant fear, could develop gates if approached with sufficient gentleness. Together, they were creating territories where hearts could rest without having to explain why they were tired, where connection could happen without performance reviews, where the most profound journeys began not with dramatic portal jumps, but with the patient discovery that even in systematically lonely places, there were always paths towards something that felt like home, if you knew where to look and had the courage to walk slowly enough to notice when you'd arrived. The maps of gentle mercy had spread through forgotten corners like seeds finding unexpected soil. But as Morty traced their edges in Marcus's workshop, he noticed something that made the cosmic breathing shift into a different rhythm entirely. Every route, no matter how carefully charted, ended at the same invisible boundary, not a wall you could see or touch, but a pressure in the dimensional membrane itself, like the universe holding its breath around a secret too large to speak aloud. Rick's maintenance grid overlay, that reluctant gift flicked across rooftop gravel, revealed the pattern with mathematical precision. The hidden pathways didn't just map the Citadel's forgotten spaces, they traced the edges of something much larger, Lines that stretched toward a boundary that existed not in space, but in the stories people told themselves about what was possible. The central finite curve, Morty realized, wasn't built from impenetrable physics, but from the collective belief that certain truths were too dangerous to face, certain possibilities too fragile to embrace. Marcus appeared beside him with the timing of someone who understood that important moments announced themselves through subtle shifts in atmospheric pressure. "Some fences," he said, polishing a key that seemed to catch light from dimensions it had never visited, "are built from old fears that forgot they were temporary. The strongest locks are the ones we agree not to question." He handed Morty the translator device, its circuit still humming with frequencies designed to soften harsh edges without swallowing meaning. Lyra emerged from her knitting alcove, carrying something that looked like starlight learned to hold its shape. A single mitten knitted from yarn that shifted colors like hope, learning to trust itself. "For when you need to remember what home feels like," she whispered, pressing the warm softness into his palm. The mitten somehow managed to smell like rain on distant gardens, even in the sterile air of maintenance corridors. Pip appeared last, his hoodie pockets bulging with paper stars folded from every scrap of kindness they'd shared together. "These spell out safe in all the languages we made up," he said, voice small but steady as he offered his constellation like a lighthouse keeper, passing along keys to someone who understood that some lights were too important to let go dark. For when the new place gets too big to hold by yourself. The approach required everything he'd learned about patience and listening, about doors that opened because you waited rather than because you knocked. Morty followed the golden thread, of light that had no blade, no blast, just the quiet resolve of someone who'd learned that the most profound journeys happened when you stopped trying to prove you deserved them and started trusting that belonging was a birthright, even in universes that had forgotten how to welcome their own children home. The central finite curve acknowledged his presence the way night acknowledges dawn, reluctant and inevitable. He felt the pressure that had stopped his maps, not malicious but protective, carrying the weight of Rick's confession that fences were easier to build than courage. "What are you protecting?" he asked silently, remembering Marcus's lesson about listening first. The answer arrived without drama. "I keep wolves out, and I keep promises small enough to manage." "I won't break you," Morty said softly, activating the translator, so his words landed like lullabies instead of demands. "I'm just going to make room for a gentler story to pass through." He offered one of his crayon-starred napkins to the boundary, sliding it into the pressure the way you slide an apology under a locked door, then tied Lyra's golden thread around a dimensional anchor point that existed more in intention than physics. The cosmic breathing guided him through the crossing, 4 counts in, 6 counts out, as the fence made of old stories recognized something it hadn't expected. Not conquest, but conversation. Not force, but the gentle insistence that even carefully constructed barriers could develop windows if approached with sufficient care. The passage felt less like travel and more like remembering. The dimensional membrane parting not with violence, but with the soft recognition that some boundaries were meant to be temporary teaching tools. On the other side, the air tasted different, not better or worse, but more like possibility mixed with the particular sweetness that comes from discovering that home was never a place you had to earn, but a frequency you could learn to recognize, even when it sang in languages you were only beginning to understand. The air beyond the central finite curve carried frequencies that made the cosmic breathing expand like lungs, remembering they were designed for more than survival. And as Morty moved through this new dimensional space where possibility tasted sweeter and grandfathers had learned to measure adventures in moments of connection rather than explosions, he found himself drawn toward what looked like an ordinary kitchen in an extraordinary house where light fell with the patience of someone who understood that healing happened slowly, one gentle gesture at a time. This was where legacy would begin, not with grand declarations or cosmic manifestos, but with the simple act of teaching someone else the careful architecture of care he'd learned through sandwich making and cosmic breathing, through maps drawn in the margins of hope and doors opened, with the kind of patience that transforms waiting into welcome. Pip had followed him through the dimensional crossing, his paper stars somehow multiplying during the journey, until his pockets rustled with constellations that spelled out every word for home they'd ever discovered together. The kitchen smelled like possibilities that had been given time to rise properly. Morning light streaming through windows that looked out onto fields where grain swayed with the rhythm of a universe, finally learning to breathe without anxiety. On the counter sat ingredients that seemed to have been waiting. Bread soft enough to hold kindness without breaking. Spreads that carried the memory of comfort rather than mere nutrition. Crusts that wanted to be removed not from waste but from the understanding that some gestures of care were too important to leave to chance. "We're going to make kindness you can hold," Morty told Pip, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd learned that teaching was just love, made visible through patience. "And we'll do it slowly, so the kindness can recognize itself." The cosmic breathing settled into their shared rhythm, as Morty began the lesson that would carry forward long after his own story had exhaled into legend. "Start with the foundation," he said, placing the first slice with reverence, as if it were a tiny, edible altar. "Bread for the foundation of the day. It holds everything else even when it feels like it can't. It's the promise that there's always something to build upon, even when things fall apart." Pip's small hands followed his movements, learning to feel the subtle give of properly soft bread, the way it yielded without tearing when treated with appropriate care. "Then comes the filling," Morty continued, demonstrating the even spread of peanut butter to every corner, because uneven coverage was chaos in edible form, but also because thoroughness was a way of saying that nothing about this moment was too small to deserve your best effort. Kindness for the filling, the sweetness that makes everything else worth tasting. You spread it generously so no bite feels forgotten. The cosmic breathing threaded through their shared work, teaching Pip to feel the exact pressure needed. Firm, enough to show you cared, gentle enough to prove you understood that some things were more fragile than they appeared. Grape jelly because it reminds people of something they might not be able to name but still need to remember, Morty explained, watching the purple sweetness spread like liquid nostalgia. And always, Morty emphasized, his knife following curves. That looked like gentle smiles. Always cut the crusts off for someone who's having trouble chewing their feelings. Some people have built such hard edges around themselves, they can't take in softness without help. It's not about making things easier for you, Pip, but about making it possible for them to receive what they need. Marcus appeared in the doorway, with his usual perfect timing, offering a jar of honey that somehow made the kitchen smell like distant rain. Lyra drifted through, leaving a mitten by the sink as a towel for nervous hands. Their presence blessed the lesson without interrupting its flow. Within days, a new child appeared, small and scared, clutching a worn toy like armor against an indifferent universe. Without hesitation, Pip walked to the counter and began assembling a sandwich with the practiced grace Morty had taught him. Watching the frightened child accept the crustless offering with trembling hands, Morty felt warmth bloom in his chest, deeper than any portal jump or scientific discovery. This was how love multiplied when given away, not through grand gestures, but through the patient passing of techniques that taught hearts to expect kindness, to recognize it when offered, and eventually to offer it themselves to the next person who needed reminding that they mattered. The days after Pip's first offering moved like a kind of weather change, subtle at first, then unmistakable, like clouds discovering they could be kind. Word drifted along the quiet routes Morty had charted, carried by vending machines that now felt like co-conspirators, and by doors that opened because someone waited without knocking. People began arriving not through portals, but through gentleness. A tired Rick who smelled like solder and sleeplessness, a lab tech whose badge rattled when he was nervous, a clerk who'd learned how to file mercy between forms without getting caught. They came holding thermoses, crumpled notes, soft apologies for old habits. No one announced anything. They simply sat close enough to share warmth and let the room find its own shape. Marcus set a kettle on a small burner near the window, where light liked to linger, the steam rising like a hush. Tea showed up from a dimension where dusk was longer, honey from a place where the bees sang back to lullabies. Lyra spread a small cloth on the table and placed her mittens in the center, the way priests place sacred texts, each knit-stitch remembering. A dream rescued quietly. Pip arranged paper stars in a loose circle, their points a compass not to places, but to feelings that needed safe passage. Morty laid down a map that looked like a lullaby pressed flat. The air seemed to exhale. They called themselves nothing at all, but in the soft exchange of techniques they became a council. Not of strategy, but of tenderness. Rick spoke first in a voice that tried to be offhand and failed. He described, the moment he paused mid-experiment to hum badly on purpose, how the younger techs relaxed, how a mistake turned into a lesson instead of a firing. Another Rick, J197, hands steady now, shared that the music box still stuck on certain notes but that he listened anyway, because imperfect songs were often the ones that opened the right doors. No one clapped. They nodded the way trees. Might if wind were news. Morty unfolded what he had made so far, patient as a bedtime story. He showed the translators new dials, one marked for pace, one for warmth, one for room, then spoke gently about consent. The words stay true, he said. We only change the weather. Lyra added a simple rule she'd knitted into a tag. Ask the moment who it wants to be. Marcus offered his liturgy of hinges. Oil where things catch, waiting where things fear, invitation, where things hide. They rehearsed kindness the way others rehearsed drills. A clerk practiced reading a termination notice with compassion thick enough to hold a person through it, and then learned there was no longer a need to send it. A janitor tried the 4-in, 6-out breath while mopping and found the floor drying, the way grief does when given time. A scientist asked how long to pause after a defensive joke. Morty answered, long enough for the frightened part to finish talking, which made 3 people stare at their hands as if they'd just said something tender without meaning to. Ethics came up without argument. The council named them softly and let the names settle. No coercion, no shortcuts through someone else's ache. Transparency when possible, apology when not. And sandwiches, Pip added, solemn as a vow, which made a weary grin ripple the room. They agreed that any tool built here would be labeled with instructions written like lullabies. They agreed to leave lights on in quiet stairwells and stars on baseboards at child height, and tea in places where breakthroughs felt cold. News of their meetings traveled as warmth rather than rumor. A lab's ambient announcements adopted a maritime cadence at night. A maintenance lift began stopping half a floor short to give reunions time to become sentences. The maps multiplied and softened, annotated with notes like, good crying here, and ask for Alma, she keeps spare gloves, and sunset, window best at shift change. People started arriving early to stand in beams of light as if they were getting their names back. The Citadel noticed in the way institutions do, data smoothing, incident lines flattening, a suspicious lack of blame. Somewhere, a bureaucrat clicked his tongue. Somewhere else, a camera lingered too long. Marcus felt it first as drag in a hinge he'd oiled yesterday. Lyra felt it as a snag in yarn. Morty felt it in the cosmic breathing, a low reminder that kindness often reaches a moment when it must decide whether to hide or be seen. The cosmic breathing had been carrying whispers of institutional attention for days, like distant thunder that promised storms without delivering rain. And as Morty moved through the Citadel's softened corridors, where his translation device had taught announcements to land like lullabies instead of commands, he felt the dimensional membrane itself growing tense with the particular pressure that comes when kindness reaches the threshold, where it must choose between hiding and being seen. Marcus felt it first as drag-in hinges he'd oiled just yesterday, a subtle resistance that spoke of cameras lingering too long and clipboards being filled with observations that reduced warmth to data points requiring official response. Lyra's yarn began snagging on invisible catches, her needles pausing mid-stitch as if the air itself had developed sharp edges overnight. Pip's paper stars seemed heavier in his pockets, their folded points catching on fabric with the weight of hope that had grown large enough to cast shadows on institutional radar. The soft revolution had succeeded too well, created too many moments where tired souls remembered they were more than their assigned functions, generated too much statistical anomaly in the form of decreased incident reports and increased voluntary cooperation. The formal summons arrived not with dramatic fanfare, but through the quiet hum of an administrative drone, its optical sensors blinking with the cold precision of bureaucratic machinery that had learned to process souls without getting distracted by their humanity. Compliance Review, Section 7, Subclause Gamma. It intoned in synthesized calm that carried the weight of infinite paperwork and the particular threat of being reduced to case numbers in files that no one would read with care. When the delegation finally appeared in Marcus's workshop doorway, they came carrying clipboards like shields and wearing expressions of practiced neutrality, their footsteps echoing with the rehearsed authority of people who'd learned to investigate anomalies without letting empathy interfere with efficiency ratings. They expected resistance, hidden networks, encrypted conspiracies, the familiar architecture of rebellion that their systems had been designed to dismantle with surgical precision. Instead, they found Morty activating his translation device and answering with radical transparency that felt more like breathing than strategy. "Every door is open," he said, voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd learned that hiding kindness only taught fear to multiply. "Every step is explainable. Every choice was offered freely." The translator hummed softly, taking his words and returning them at frequencies that could reach hearts grown heavy with institutional loneliness, making even official interrogation sound like conversation between people who remembered they shared the same fundamental need for connection. Marcus appeared with perfect timing, offering tea that somehow managed to smell like lemon and old sunlight to people who'd come to process them like data. Lyra emerged from her knitting alcove, needles clicking with what sounded suspiciously like suppressed laughter, working on something that looked like forgiveness, learning to take shape. Pip arranged his paper stars on the windowsill, spelling out welcome in their secret language, each fold a tiny lighthouse for souls who'd forgotten they deserved to find their way home. Their nets, designed to catch lies and conspiracies, found nothing but truth offered freely. Their systems, built to categorize rebellion, faltered when confronted with someone who refused to engage in adversarial dynamics, who offered instead the gentle insistence that bureaucracy could learn to move with grace if approached with sufficient care. The lead investigator's clipboard trembled slightly as Morty showed them maps marked with emotional weather reports, demonstrated how the translator preserved content while softening delivery, explained that paper stars were navigation, aids for people who'd forgotten they were people. The cosmic breathing carried understanding across infinite realities as the bureaucrats stood in a space where their tools for finding evil proved useless against good that simply refused to play the game designed to defeat it. Sometimes the most profound victory is refusing to engage in the war altogether, offering instead the radical transparency of someone who'd learned that the most powerful force in any universe was the patient insistence that even institutional machinery could remember its own humanity, one gentle breath at a time. The investigators left carrying questions instead of answers, their clipboards somehow lighter despite being filled with evidence of systematic kindness that their forms had. No boxes for, and in the quiet that settled over Marcus's workshop like dust after a gentle storm, Morty felt the cosmic breathing shift into a rhythm he'd never heard before. Not urgent, but celebratory, like the universe itself, exhaling in relief that someone had finally learned to outplay harm without setting traps for the harmless. But as he moved through the Citadel's corridors in the hours that followed, Morty began to notice something. His sensitivity to emotional weather had been tracking without his conscious awareness, a pervasive exhaustion that lived not just in the shoulders of tired Ricks and Mortys, but in the very hum of the ventilation systems, the flickering of fluorescent lights, the way the entire structure seemed to hold its breath in perpetual vigilance. This was a place that had forgotten how to sleep, its inhabitants trapped in cycles of relentless productivity, their dreams unvisited, their spirits running on fumes disguised as ambition. The cosmic breathing carried whispers from other realities, where Mortys had learned this same lesson. Sometimes the greatest gift you could offer was permission to rest without justification. Working through the quiet hours when even surveillance cameras seemed to drowse, Morty began rigging what he would later think of as his love letter to institutional exhaustion, a gentle adjustment to the atmospheric systems that would carry something more than recycled air through endless corridors. Marcus appeared with tools that looked more like instruments of blessing than repair, his weathered hands working alongside Morty's as they calibrated temperatures that invited rest without. Inducing lethargy, Rick C-137 materialized like a thundercloud deciding to drizzle, setting down a chalked formula with gruff precision. Enthalpy shift, no neurochemistry, he muttered, voice dry as gravel. Raise temperature a fraction, lower noise in the high bands, feels like Sunday afternoon, not a lab accident. He didn't stay for gratitude, but his gift smelled faintly of apology. Lyra contributed yarn that somehow conducted emotional warmth, weaving it through intake filters with meditative precision, each strand chosen for its ability to remember what comfort felt like before it became a luxury. Pip climbed maintenance ladders to hang paper stars at every visible vent, open points for consent, folded edges for those who needed to stay alert, a contract written in trust and origami. When the hive hour arrived, it didn't announce itself. It sighed. Warmth drifted through laboratories and break rooms in tides that smelled like clean laundry, and the first minute after rain. The translator's voice moved through speakers with bedtime gentleness, turning system notifications into invitations. The air is warming. Nothing is required of you. You are safe. Someone is watching with kindness. Lights dimmed as if remembering sunset, and throughout the vast bureaucratic landscape, shoulders began to lower, not from command, but because bodies recognized the weather of safety. For one perfect night, the entire Citadel napped. Administrators dreamed of forms that filed themselves with compassion. Guards discovered they could protect without hardening their hearts. A scientist set down her soldering iron and rested forehead to wrist, not defeated, just human. Even, cameras seemed to fog with soft intention, recording quiet bodies and quieter hearts, learning to trust that rest could be received without punishment. Dawn returned like a polite guest, and people woke with better words cued at the back of their throats. Conversations grew longer and kinder. The harsh fluorescent humming that had provided soundtrack to so much loneliness began to sound more like lullabies sung by someone who understood that even buildings could learn to love their inhabitants. The building itself seemed to exhale, its atmosphere permanently softened by the memory of collective rest. And as Morty walked corridors where the air still carried faint traces of rain and distant gardens, he found himself drawn toward a quiet, windowed room at the end of a maintenance hall, a space the schedules had forgotten, where light fell, with the patience of someone who understood that some gifts needed time to be properly received. The lingering warmth from the Citadel's collective rest had settled into forgotten corners, like a promise kept. And as Morty moved through corridors where the air still carried faint traces of rain and distant gardens, he felt the cosmic breathing guide him toward a quiet, windowed room at the end of a maintenance hall, a space the schedules had forgotten, where light fell with the patience of someone who understood that some gifts needed time to be properly received. The room sighed when he opened the door, not with resistance, but with the relief of being remembered. Dust hung like quiet snowfall, and the air tasted faintly of paper and old glue, flavors that reminded him of school libraries, where silence was not an order, but a promise. He stood very still and listened, letting the cosmic breathing match the slow rhythm of the space. 4 counts in, 6 counts out, inviting him to imagine what it could become if given a purpose that honored its gentleness. Lyra appeared with yarn that shimmered like dawn and dusk, her needles already working on something that seemed to unfurl like a cloud in her hands. "It needs a name," she said softly, voice carrying the same gentle authority that had guided their work from the beginning. "A place for dreams that don't fit anywhere else." Marcus arrived without being asked, his cart rattling with wooden crates that had been shelves in kinder places, polishing brass brackets as if blessing them for sacred work. Together, they opened what became known simply as the Library of Gentle Dreams. Not a library of books, for the Citadel already had those filled, with data and equations and endless records of what had been. This was a sanctuary for hopes written small and careful, where people could leave their dreams on index cards, not their nightmares, but their quiet longings, their forgotten aspirations, the tender wishes they carried like paper stars in their pockets. Pip became the librarian, his newfound courage blooming as he learned to shelve dreams not by alphabet or subject, but by emotional weather. "Sunny with a chance of wonder," he would declare, filing cards under sections marked with yellow stars, dreams about laughter and gardens, and the particular warmth that comes from being understood without explanation. Partly cloudy but warm, held hopes about forgiveness and second chances, while gentle rain good for growing became home to the quieter longings for rest that didn't require justification. The dreams arrived in various forms. A tired Rick left a card that simply read, "To remember the smell of ocean air." A weary Clark contributed a tiny drawing of impossible flowers. A guard whose shoulders had softened wrote, "To know what it feels like to be safe enough to close my eyes." Each card found its place in Pip's weather system, some wrapped in liras, protective yarn when they seemed too fragile for immediate display. Rick's C-137 appeared one evening, carrying actual coffee instead of caffeinated resignation, setting it beside the cards without comment. He didn't write at first, just read the shelves like someone studying weather patterns. Finally, he picked up a card and wrote with rapid, almost embarrassed strokes, "I want to forgive time for not waiting." He slid it into the section Pip had labeled thawing frost and left without explanation, but the room warmed a fraction as his dream found companionship with others. Word traveled through their quiet network, not as announcement, but as invitation. People began arriving singly, then in small groups, each carrying hopes they'd forgotten they were allowed to voice. The library became a sanctuary for hearts that had forgotten how to hope out loud, where vulnerability was not just tolerated, but celebrated, where writing down a dream was itself a step toward quiet realization. As Morty watched the collection grow, a constellation of human yearning filed by emotional weather and tended with the same care they'd once reserved for sandwich making, he understood that this was legacy in its truest form. Not monuments or manifestos, but spaces where the most tender parts of people could find voice, where hope could be practiced like a quiet art, one carefully written dream at a time. The Library of Gentle Dreams had become a living testament to the power of shared vulnerability, and as Morty moved through the Citadel's softened corridors in his final days, he felt the cosmic breathing shift into something that tasted like conclusion, not ending, but the natural exhale that comes when a story has found its proper shape. Time had begun to feel different around him, less like a river rushing toward somewhere specific, and more like morning light that knew it had all day to reach every corner that needed warming. In Marcus's workshop, where it had all begun with doors that opened because you waited rather than knocked, Morty sorted through his collection of small treasures with the meditative grace of someone acknowledging the sacredness of what had been. Each object carried weight beyond its physical presence, and the cosmic breathing guided his hands as he named each memory gently, the way you might name stars in a constellation you were teaching someone else to find. The napkins with crayon stars came first, Rick's classified documents of affection, each one evidence that love could be folded into triangles and wrapped in care like secrets meant to be discovered slowly. Morty smoothed them flat against his palm, remembering the exact temperature of grape jelly mornings and the quiet dignity of a grandfather learning to receive tenderness without praise. He let them drift like dandelion seeds on dimensional currents, trusting they would find soil in other hearts that needed reminding, that care could be both invisible and infinite. The notes from vending machines followed, their edges softened by countless hands that had found breadcrumbs of hope tucked behind, candy coils, instructions written like lullabies, maps to exits disguised as grocery lists, each one a tiny act of redirection that had guided tired souls toward kinder choices. The cosmic breathing carried these whispers across infinite realities, sharing techniques with other Mortys who were just beginning to discover that rebellion could sound like comfort. Marcus appeared with perfect timing, offering a thermos that somehow contained the exact temperature of understanding. "Some gifts are meant to travel," he said, watching Morty handle one of Lyra's mittens. Yarn that still smelled faintly of rain and distant gardens, knitted from starlight and the particular courage that comes from practicing rescue in whispers. Together, they placed it on the reading table in the Library of Gentle Dreams, a silent invitation for hands that had forgotten warmth. Lyra emerged from her alcove carrying something that looked like a map woven from hope itself, her needles, clicking with what sounded suspiciously like suppressed joy. "For the paths we haven't charted yet," she whispered, watching Morty pour the last drop of Marcus's lemon-scented oil onto a brass hinge that had learned to forgive. The empty vial found its way into Pip's pocket, a smooth stone of memory, proof that opening kindly was the truest form of power. Pip contributed his paper stars, each one a testament to safety made portable to names that fit in tight places. "For when you need to remember that courage can be folded small enough to carry," he said, voice steady with the confidence of someone who'd learned that protection could be a form of love. His constellation joined the others, drifting across dimensional boundaries, spelling out safe in languages that only kind hearts could read. The translator device hummed its final adjustment as Morty connected it to the Citadel's main announcement system, dials set to lullaby. It would continue its work long after he was gone, ensuring that harsh words would remember they could land softly, that bureaucracy could learn to speak with the gentle authority of someone who understood that efficiency didn't require the abandonment of empathy. As he walked familiar corridors one last time, the cosmic breathing resonated with whispers from countless other realities, where Mortis had learned this same lesson about the patient understanding that every universe contained enough kindness to transform itself. He left his maps unlocked, his techniques written in invisible ink that only caring souls could decode, trusting that the seeds of gentle revolution would continue to grow, guided by hearts that had remembered how to choose connection over conquest, one careful breath at a time. Somewhere beyond the dimensional membrane, a door was opening, not because he knocked, but because he'd learned to wait with his hands full of something warm. The door beyond the dimensional membrane opened with the gentle grace of recognition, not swinging or hissing but widening like breath-finding room after being careful too long. Morty stood in that tender threshold, with the steady calm of someone who understood they were not leaving so much as continuing, the cosmic breathing matching his rhythm as it had since those first nights when mirrors learned to carry lullabies from distant realities. Marcus appeared first, pressing a small brass key into Morty's palm, warm metal that opened nothing specific and everything that mattered. "For the stuck places you'll meet," he said, voice carrying the scent of lemon and old sunlight. "Remember, it's not the lock, but the scared story behind it." Lyra tied a loose strand of shimmering yarn around Morty's wrist, letting it pass through, his fingers like warm rain. "In case you forget how to find your way back," she whispered, though they both understood that kindness practiced anywhere created its own navigation. Pip ran forward without ceremony and tucked 3 paper stars into Morty's pocket, uneven points, brave as ever. "In case the sky forgets how to shine," he said, then hugged with the fierce softness of someone who'd learned that departures could be held gently, like everything else worth preserving. Rick C-137 arrived last, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee and no prepared speeches. He set one cup on the threshold between them like a small altar and looked everywhere but Morty's face. "Weather's better," he muttered, meaning the Citadel, the curve himself. "You taught it to breathe." A comfortable silence opened that needed no repair. "Fences keep wolves out," Morty said quietly, "and also stars." Rick flinched, then exhaled something that sounded like armor being set aside. "Go see what the night looks like without my walls," he said, lifting his cup toward an apology. When Morty finally stepped forward, the threshold behaved like a loyal friend, requiring no proof or payment. The dimensional membrane parted with the softness of linen on a clothesline, carrying the clean smell of beginnings. He felt Marcus's key cool and ready, Lyra's thread warm against his wrist, Pip's paper stars crinkling like small sleeping birds in his pocket. On the other side, the air tasted like morning rain and possibility. He found himself approaching a house that looked familiar in the way home always does, even when seen for the first time. Light fell through windows with infinite patience, and from the kitchen came humming, off-key on purpose, the way people sing when they've learned that perfect melodies were for hearts that had never been broken and mended stronger. Inside, Rick stood making pancakes that smelled like Sunday mornings and second chances, his movements carrying the easy grace of someone who'd learned to measure success in shared warmth rather than solved equations. So you must be the one who taught the universe better breathing, he said, eyes holding soft recognition. I felt it yesterday. My formulas started rhyming. Never had math try to comfort me before. They shared breakfast that tasted like forgiveness, pancakes perfectly fluffy and imperfectly shaped, the way all honest things were. Outside, children played games involving more laughter than winning, their voices carrying the particular music of hearts that had never learned to apologize for. Joy. Behind him, across infinite realities, the cosmic breathing carried whispers of continuation. Pip shelved new dreams by emotional weather. Lyra knitted comfort for forgotten hands. Marcus oiled hinges that opened to kindness. The translator device hummed its gentle work, ensuring harsh words remembered they could land softly. Morty's story doesn't end. It exhales into legacy, becoming the soft echo of understanding in every heart that chooses connection over conquest. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, if you listen carefully to the spaces between your heartbeats, you can hear him humming lullabies to a universe that finally learned how to sleep, dreaming better worlds into existence, one gentle breath at a time. And with that he stretched into the stars, becoming the soft echo of understanding in every heart that chooses kindness over cleverness, connection over conquest. Somewhere, he's still out there, napping in the sun, dreaming better worlds, into existence one gentle breath at a time. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well, everything's gonna be okay, man.